The hour of unease. When the sun had dropped behind the rolling hills and the last embers of daylight glowed faintly on the edges of the horizon, the medieval village slipped into a kind of silence that was unlike the stillness of modern nights. This was not the comforting quiet of well-lit streets or of homes warmed by steady fires, but a silence woven from the uncertainty of darkness itself. The air was thick with scents of tilled soil, cooling after the day's heat, mingled with the lingering smoke of hearths being banked for the night, and every creak of wood or rustle in the underbrush seemed magnified in that dim world. In this time, before lamps or lanterns could be relied upon, before roads were steady underfoot, the coming of night was a force as real as rain or hunger, and it carried a weight of unease that pressed on the minds of all who lived in its shadow. It was an hour when peasants gathered close within their timbered homes, shutters drawn against the chill, but even then, the silence pressed through cracks in the walls, reminding them of a world outside where unseen presences were thought to stir. In these hours, the villagers often told themselves that the world beyond their doors was not empty, that the night was alive with invisible spirits walking the same paths they themselves had trodden during the day. Fields that had been ploughed and sown under the bright watch of the sun now seemed to belong to something else entirely, something hidden and intangible. The roads that connected hamlet to hamlet were not seen as lines of safety, but of vulnerability, threads where forces of mischief or malice might travel. Every dog's bark in the distance, every owl's cry from the woodland, could be heard as an omen, the kind of sound that stirred unease in the pit of the stomach. In such moments, the sense of community grew sharper, because the people felt that to endure the night, they must endure it together. The peasants had their reasons for such wariness, reasons that went beyond idle superstition. Life was fragile in the Middle Ages. Famine could turn a thriving season into despair, plague could sweep through a town with invisible speed, and a poor harvest could be understood as punishment from forces unseen. Without the knowledge of germs or crop cycles as we understand them now, the explanations leaned into the unseen. Spirits of air and earth, demons of night and weather, shadows that could press on one's chest and steal breath away. To people so exposed, the night became a natural theatre for such fears. What could not be explained by day's reason might be blamed on the night's power. As the villagers huddled near their fires, voices often dropped to whispers when speaking of the darkness outside. Stories passed from elder to child of figures glimpsed in the corner of the eye, of lanterns that vanished into thin air, of footsteps on empty lanes. These were not told merely as entertainment, but as warnings, and in the telling, they shaped how the entire community approached nightfall. It was not enough to lock doors or latch shutters. Something more was required to drive away the unseen, something that would affirm the villagers' strength in the face of what they feared. The hours after sundown were not only hours of rest, but hours when one might be tested by what moved beyond the glow of the hearth. It was in this atmosphere, heavy with dread yet brimming with belief, that the habit of the night procession found its root. To step outside after darkness was to risk not only the cold but an encounter with what could not be touched or reasoned with. And yet, paradoxically, the act of leaving the safety of home together was seen as a way to reclaim mastery of the night. The village did not remain passive, locked away while unseen forces prowled. Instead, they chose to step into the darkness with fire in hand, with voices raised, with symbols of protection carried proudly. This was not a gesture of recklessness but of necessity. Thus, the hour of unease became the hour of preparation. Men and women, children and elders, all felt the subtle pull of responsibility, for to remain inside was to leave one's fields and thresholds unguarded, and every life in the community depended on the fertility of the soil, the safety of the harvest, the well-being of the livestock. They tied cloaks tighter, gathered tools and objects believed to hold power, and waited for the signal to step out together. The murmur of prayers mingled with the clatter of boots against stone, and the thin light of torches began to pierce the village lanes. At this threshold between silence and action, between home and the dark beyond, a ritual was born that would define the rhythm of their nights. And so, as the world around them sank into blackness, the villagers would rise, their unease transformed into movement, their fear transmuted into ritual. The night would belong not only to the spirits they dreaded, but also to the people who, by stepping together into the unseen, created a strange and solemn bond with the darkness itself. Whispers of the invisible. Once the first steps carried the villagers into the darkened lanes, the air itself seemed to shift, as if it recognized their intrusion. The night in the Middle Ages was not empty space, but a realm thought to be inhabited, thick with presences that could not be grasped but were felt all the same. Farmers, shepherds, and woodcutters alike whispered of beings that slipped unseen between hedges and cottages, that drifted through the furrows of ploughed land, that lingered at the edges of barns and byres where animals slept. These whispers were not inventions of idle tongues, but the natural offspring of an age when every sound beyond the reach of sight demanded explanation. If a gate creaked open though no hand was there, if a rooster crowed in the dead of night, if an ox refused to move without cause, it was easier to believe that spirits were at work than to imagine randomness in a world where nothing was thought random. The villagers gave names to these entities, though the names varied from one hamlet to the next, from one dialect to another. In some valleys, they were called the wandering dead, souls unable to rest who drifted back to the places they once knew. In others, they were thought to be malicious sprites, offspring of the forest's heart, jealous of mankind's fields carved from the wilderness. Old women spoke of shadow men who slipped beneath thresholds, pressing upon sleepers until their breath came ragged and shallow. Children, who were always the most sensitive to such terrors, shivered at tales of pale women seen crossing the village green at dusk, never leaving footprints, never answering when spoken to. Whether benevolent, mischievous, or cruel, all such beings were bound together by one truth. They were invisible to the eye, yet believed to be vividly present to the soul. As the villagers walked in clusters, torches casting long, leaping shapes on the ground, the conversations murmured between them were filled with these whispers. No one dared speak too boldly of the spirits, lest naming them should call them closer, but everyone shared the unspoken knowledge that their steps were accompanied by more than flesh and blood. Even the most skeptical, the man who scoffed at omens in the daylight, found himself hushed and wary when he trod the midnight path. The sound of his own footsteps seemed to echo oddly, as though another tread fell just behind, never overtaking, never seen. In this way, the entire company was wrapped not only in firelight, but in an invisible audience. Fears of the unseen were strengthened by the seasons themselves. During the waning of autumn, when fields lay bare and winds rushed cold over the land, stories of spirits were at their height. It was then believed that the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, that the departed might return in search of warmth or sustenance. During the height of summer, when storms struck with violence and lightning set barns ablaze, villagers spoke of wrathful forces riding the winds, invisible but destructive, demanding respect and appeasement. Even the calmness of spring nights could not dispel the whispers, for the fertility of the soil was thought to be threatened by envious beings who wished to spoil the work of man. Thus, in every turn of the year, the invisible found a place to dwell in the imagination of the people, shaping their fears, guiding their habits, and giving form to the unseen mysteries of their world. This constant presence of the invisible shaped not only the night processions but the very rhythm of medieval life. Before a field was sown, words were muttered not simply as prayers but as protection. When livestock sickened, the cause was traced to an ill wind or an unseen hand that had brushed too close. When a child woke crying in the dark, it was not always hunger or dreams, but the touch of something that passed by. These beliefs were not idle curiosities. They were the fabric of daily understanding, threads woven into every action, every choice. To modern eyes it may seem fanciful, but for those who lived by the flickering torch, the unseen was as solid as the soil underfoot. And so the whispers filled the night as the procession moved on. Faces were serious, steps deliberate, and though voices sometimes lifted in chant or song, in the quiet intervals between, there always seemed to linger another sound, softer than the crackle of pitch, quieter than the shuffle of boots. It was the sound of the invisible world breathing alongside the villagers, reminding them that their torches were not lit in vain, that their songs were not sung for nothing. They were not alone, and that knowledge, both fearful and strangely reassuring, drove them ever onward into the heart of the night. The birth of the processions. The processions were not always a fixture of village life. They arose slowly, born from countless nights of unease, until what began as scattered gestures became a custom carried by entire communities. At first, there may have been only a few figures, the boldest or most desperate, who dared to step into the dark lanes after sunset. Perhaps it was a farmer whose crops had been blighted, convinced that restless spirits lingered over his furrows, or a mother whose child had fallen sick in the night, and who believed that walking with a torch could drive away the invisible hand pressing upon the crib. These solitary acts, repeated here and there, caught the attention of neighbours. When the sick child recovered, or the farmer claimed his field seemed spared of harm, whispers turned into imitation, and others began to take up the same practice. Over time, what was once the isolated effort of the fearful grew into the collective rhythm of a village. The birth of the procession was as much an act of solidarity as it was of superstition. Fear is a heavy burden when borne alone, but when carried together, it becomes something almost bearable, even empowering. A man who might have quailed at the idea of facing the dark spirits beyond his threshold found courage when flanked by his kin, his neighbours, his friends. In a world where survival itself depended upon mutual aid, ploughing fields together, raising barns, sharing food in lean years, it was only natural that the defence against the unseen should also become a communal effort. And so, instead of cowering separately within timbered walls, villagers poured forth into the lanes as a single body, flames aloft, voices rising. The act was no longer one of fear, but of defiance. The shape of these processions was not accidental. They followed the contours of daily life, tracing the very borders of the village that most needed protection. The circuit around fields was not just symbolic. It was believed that by walking the perimeter, the people established a living barrier against intrusion. Paths wound past barns where animals slept, for livestock was the heartbeat of survival, too precious to be left vulnerable to wandering spirits. Sometimes, processions would even skirt the churchyard, as though to reinforce the link between sacred ground and the fragile lives outside its consecrated walls. The ritual order of these walks mirrored the order that villagers longed to impose upon a world where chaos, be it famine, plague, or storm, always threatened to spill in. The gatherings did not always come at a fixed hour, but often began when the weight of night pressed hardest, when the silence grew unbearable. In some places, a horn might be blown to summon people from their houses, the mournful sound carrying across thatched roofs and cobbled lanes. In others, a church bell might be rung, not for worship but for warding, its echoes calling all to rise. People emerged with what they had, bundles of straw wrapped in pitch to serve as torches, iron pots and pans to clang into the night, staves and tools not only for walking but for striking the earth in rhythmic defiance. The procession was thus a patchwork of what was available, yet it carried the solemnity of ceremony, for everyone understood its importance. At first glance, these processions might have seemed chaotic voices overlapping, flames flickering, boots clattering on uneven stones, but in truth they carried a hidden order. The presence of elders lent authority, the energy of youth brought movement, and the steady hands of women carried the torches with patience. Even children had their roles, trailing behind with small rattles or bells, their shrill cries adding to the tumult that was thought to drive spirits away. What bound them together was the belief that no one was excluded. To defend the village, all must take part. In those moments, distinctions of wealth or standing melted away, and the village became a single entity confronting the unknown. In time, the processions became something more than a reaction to fear. They became tradition. Nights of ritual walking were anticipated, prepared for, and spoken of in advance. Stories of past processions, of strange lights seen at the edge of the woods, of sudden winds that extinguished torches, of livestock found safe the following morning were retold with the rhythm of legend. In each telling, the importance of the ritual grew stronger until no one doubted its necessity. A village without its procession was a village unprotected, and thus the birth of this habit became not only a response to whispers of the invisible, but an identity, a shared performance of resistance against forces, both real and imagined. In this way, what began as a handful of brave or desperate individuals stepping into the night became a nightly drama enacted by entire communities, a ritual that transformed unease into unity and fear into action. The birth of the processions was less a single event than a gradual awakening, a realization that while the night belonged to unseen spirits, it could also belong to those who dared to walk together, torches blazing, voices uniting, chasing shadows back into the dark. Torches against the darkness. The first necessity for any procession was light, for the night of the Middle Ages was thick and unyielding. Without the steady glow of street lamps or the pale wash of electricity, darkness fell with a weight that was absolute, swallowing lanes, hedges and fields until the world seemed to vanish just a few paces away. To step into that blackness without light was to invite panic, and so torches became both weapon and companion. Every household knew the craft of making them, though methods varied by what the land could spare. In some villages, bundles of straw were wound tightly and soaked in pitch, the black resin giving them a fierce and smoky flame. Elsewhere, sticks of pine were split and stuffed with resine-rich splinters, crackling with vigor when set alight. The torches sputtered, hissed, and spat, sending up showers of sparks that sometimes seemed like stars dragged down to earth. Carrying a torch was more than practical, it was symbolic. Fire was the oldest guardian of humankind, a force that tamed beasts and banished cold, and the villagers knew its value not only in hearths but in the open dark. A flickering torch was believed to ward off the unseen as surely as it pushed back the shadows. Spirits, it was said, disliked the brightness, shrinking from its heat and its glare. To hold a flame aloft was to claim a fragment of day within the dominion of night. Thus, each villager with a torch became not only a participant, but a bearer of protection, carrying into the blackness the assurance that no unseen presence could cross the circle of firelight. The torches transformed the appearance of the procession itself. Seen from a distance, the line of flames winding across the fields resembled a river of fire, a moving serpent that hissed and roared as it went. The smoke curled and drifted upward, carrying the smell of pitch and resin into the sky, mingling with the cold night air. Faces lit from below looked strange and otherworldly, their features sharpened, their eyes gleaming, their shadows stretching grotesquely against cottages and trees. In such light, the villagers themselves seemed almost like spirits, frightening and unrecognizable even to one another. Children clutched their mothers' hands tighter, unsure whether to fear the unseen beyond the light or the strange new shapes their neighbors had become within it. The act of keeping torches alight was itself a ritual. Flames needed constant tending, for the night wind could be treacherous. Men carried spare bundles of straw, women held clay pots of embers to relight flames that faltered, and children watched closely for sparks that might fall into the dry grass. Each flicker of light that guttered out seemed a small defeat, a breach in the fiery wall that protected the village, and so there was always a rush to rekindle it, to mend the living chain of fire. In this way, tending the torches became an act of vigilance, as important as the chanting or the beating of drums, a reminder that protection required effort, not merely hope. The symbolism of the torch extended even into the minds of those who watched from their windows. For those too frail or fearful to join, the sight of flames passing by the lane outside was reassurance enough. It meant the community was awake, watchful, alive with defiance against the night. Old women murmured prayers as the light flickered across their shutters, while children peered out from behind wooden slats, hearts pounding as the fiery glow painted their walls. The torch was thus not only a tool for those who carried it, but a beacon for all, binding the hidden and the visible alike into a shared act of warding. Some elders said that the fire itself remembered. They told that each spark falling to the earth left behind a trace, a mark that would remain until the following dawn, too faint for eyes to see but strong enough to keep wandering spirits at bay. This belief lent even greater weight to the processions, for it meant that the very act of walking with torches inscribed invisible circles of safety around the village. Every flame that burned was thought to write protection upon the soil, a glowing script that no spirit could cross. And whether or not such writings truly existed, the conviction that they did gave courage to the villagers, fueling their resolve to keep the fires blazing bright. Thus, the torches became the heart of the procession, their crackle and glow, their smoke and heat, their fragile endurance in the face of wind and shadow. To walk without them was unthinkable, for without fire the night was stronger, but with them The villagers felt that they carried the essence of day itself into the kingdom of darkness, striking fear into the hearts of invisible wanderers. In the torchlight, the village was transformed into a moving constellation, a band of stars marching across the earth, united in purpose, fierce in its fragile brightness. And so, every night, the torches rose, fire answering darkness. The old and primal battle played out anew on the fields of men. The ringing of bells. If fire was the most visible defense against the unseen, then sound was its invisible twin, spreading outward into the darkness in ripples that no spirit could resist. Among all sounds, the ringing of bells was held in the greatest esteem. Bells were not merely objects of metal and clapper, but vessels of mystery, thought to carry within them the power of heaven's voice. To hear them at night, not for mass or marriage or mourning, but for warding, was to hear a reminder that the village did not stand alone. Their tones rose into the air, rolling across rooftops and hedges, bouncing against the hills, and slipping into the woods where unseen things were thought to linger. The church bell, suspended in its tower, was often the first to sound. Its deep, sonorous note set the rhythm of the night, marking the procession's beginning and guiding its steps. Yet not every village could afford a bell large enough to hang in stone towers. Where such grandeur was lacking, the people turned to what they had: smaller handbells, cowbells hung around the necks of animals, iron triangles beaten with sticks, pots and pans clanged in wild rhythm. All these sounds, whether harmonious or chaotic, carried the same intent: to startle and scatter any spirit bold enough to draw near. The cacophony itself became a shield, a sonic wall that moved with the procession as surely as the torches lit its path. There was logic beneath the superstition. In a world without lamps or lanterns, sound travelled farther than sight. The villagers knew that if their chants and bells could be heard at the farthest field or in the deep hollow where shadows gathered, then those spaces were included in the protection. Children laughed nervously as they rang their little rattles, their sharp tones cutting the silence. Men shook iron clappers until their arms ached. Women carried bundles of reeds that whistled eerily when swung through the air. It was not music as we think of it, but noise fashioned into ritual, a declaration that the living had claimed this night for themselves. The ringing of bells carried with it an added layer of meaning, for bells had long been associated with sacred power. Priests blessed them with holy water, invoking the saints to dwell in their bronze curves. To ring a bell was thus not only to make a sound, but to summon sanctity into the air, a sanctity that would ripple outward and drive away profane presences. Elders told children that spirits detested the clear tone of bells, for it reminded them of what they could never possess: the peace of consecrated ground. To walk behind the toll of a bell was to walk within a moving circle of holiness, its sound weaving a barrier as real as any hedge or wall. At times, the sound itself seemed to answer the villagers' fears. When the clamour grew loudest, when bells and pans and rattles merged into a storm of sound, sudden gusts of wind might stir the trees, and people would nod knowingly, convinced that something unseen had fled before them. If a dog barked in alarm at the far edge of the fields only to fall silent as the procession drew near, it was taken as proof that the sound had scattered whatever lingered there. Even the quiet between tolls held meaning. The fading echoes were thought to chase spirits farther and farther away, thinning their ranks until the land was left clear. The bell's voice also served to unite the villagers themselves. Just as a torch marked the bearer's presence in the dark, so did the bell tie each participant into the greater whole. The rhythm of clanging and ringing became a pulse that guided their steps, making them feel less like a scattered crowd and more like a single organism marching together. No one voice could command such unity, but the sound of bells could, and in its resonance the people felt stronger, braver, more certain of their purpose. It was a reminder that they were not individuals braving the dark, but a community armed with fire and sound, guardians of one another's lives. Over time, certain bells grew famous. Villagers swore that one particular cowbell, passed down through generations, could scatter shadows faster than any other, or that a cracked church bell still carried strength because of the prayers poured into it. These tales only deepened the sense that bells were not inert objects but living companions, guardians who joined the people in their midnight task. To hear them ringing was to know that the night was not silent, that the invisible could not reign unopposed. And so, the ringing of bells became the heartbeat of the procession, a rhythm of defiance echoing into the vast and listening dark. Chants in the night. If the torches lit the path and the bells shattered the silence, then the chants gave the night procession its voice, binding the people together in a living tide of sound that rolled through the darkness. Words were chosen not for beauty but for strength, their rhythms steady, their tones rising and falling like waves. Some chants were prayers drawn from the Latin of the Church, phrases half understood by peasants who repeated them by rote, yet believed them powerful because priests spoke them at the altar. Other chants were older, remnants of folk songs that mothers had sung to children at the cradle, or shepherds had murmured to their flocks beneath the stars. Between the sacred and the ancestral, the night was filled with a tapestry of voices that seemed to hover just above the earth, stretching out in invisible cords that wrapped the village in safety. The words were simple, for simplicity carried farthest. A line of 3 or 4 phrases might be repeated endlessly, weaving a spell not through variety but through endurance. A man might call out a verse, his voice rough and resonant, and the crowd would answer with a refrain, the reply swelling until even the timid and the young joined in. The repetition dulled fear, for in speaking the same words again and again, the mind ceased to wander toward what unseen shapes might lurk in the hedges. The chant became a rhythm for the body as well as the spirit. Footsteps fell in time to the syllables, and the flicker of torches seemed to sway with the cadence of sound. Not all voices were steady. Some cracked with age, others trembled with fatigue, and children sometimes broke into laughter before quickly joining back in. Yet this irregularity did not weaken the chants. It made them human. It gave the procession the sound of a living thing, flawed but determined, rising together in a harmony that was not smooth but resilient. The words tumbled into the night, carried by wind, scattered by hills, but always gathering back into a whole. When echoes returned from the woods or from the walls of a distant barn, villagers nodded in satisfaction, convinced the land itself was repeating their protection back to them. Certain chants were reserved for particular dangers. If sickness had struck the animals, lines invoking the archangel Michael, protector of flocks, were spoken. If children had been restless or plagued by nightmares, verses calling upon the Virgin were sung in softer, more tender tones. There were harsher chants as well, almost like shouts, meant to drive away malevolent beings with words as sharp as thrown stones. These cries often had no clear meaning, little more than syllables strung together, but they carried the weight of anger and defiance. It was said that spirits feared such cries most of all, for they were raw sound untempered by reason, the human voice stripped to its most primal force. The chants also created an atmosphere that blurred the line between the earthly and the otherworldly. In the glow of torches, with smoke rising and bells clanging, the droning voices gave the impression that the villagers themselves had become something more than human. Strangers arriving at such a scene might have thought they had stumbled upon a ghostly army or a band of monks caught in some endless ritual. Children often whispered that, as they chanted, they felt as if their feet were no longer touching the ground, as though the words carried them forward like a tide. This sensation, though fleeting, left a deep impression, convincing them that the procession truly did weave a barrier between their world and that of spirits. Between chants, there were moments of silence, but these silences were not empty. Breath came in unison, boots shuffled against soil, torches crackled, and somewhere a dog barked or a horse shifted in its stall. Then, as if on cue, another voice would rise, beginning the refrain anew, and the whole group would follow. It was a cycle of sound and stillness, echo and anticipation, like waves striking the shore again and again. The villagers did not need to see their enemy, for they could feel the resistance in the air, as though the night itself recoiled from their voices. The memory of these chants lingered long after the procession ended. In the mornings, when dew sparkled on the fields, men claimed they still heard faint echoes drifting across the meadows, as though the land remembered the night's words. Women swore that children slept more peacefully after a night of chanting, their rest unbroken, their dreams untroubled, and when a harvest was gathered safely, or when illness passed by the village, leaving it unscathed, credit was given not only to prayer but to the chants that had filled the dark, carrying the will of the people into every corner of the unseen. Thus, the chants in the night became more than sound. They became breath woven into ritual, words hammered into shields, voices that refused to be silent in the face of fear. As torches burned and bells rang, it was the chanting that gave the procession its soul, a voice raised not only to protect the living, but to remind the invisible that this world was guarded, watched, and claimed by those who dared to sing into the darkness. Children and elders. Together, no procession could truly take form without the presence of both its youngest and oldest members, for in the villages of the Middle Ages, every soul carried a part in the nightly defense. Children, with their high, shrill voices and quick, darting steps, were seen as natural allies in the fight against the unseen, for it was believed that spirits feared the vitality of youth, the energy that they themselves lacked. Elders, by contrast, brought gravitas, wisdom, and a connection to the generations before, for they remembered stories of past processions and knew which chants or gestures had proved most potent in fending off misfortune. When the two extremes of age walked side by side, the community saw a mirror of the eternal cycle of life, and the ritual carried the force of continuity that stretched back into memory and forward into hope. Children were rarely left at home when the procession began. To lock them in their beds while others walked the lanes was to leave them unguarded, exposed to any restless spirit that might slip through a shutter or chimney. Better to bring them out into the night, to place a torch in a small hand, or a bell, or even a clay rattle filled with pebbles. Their laughter, though nervous, mixed with the chants, and their shouts rang out with an energy that older voices could no longer summon. Mothers carried the youngest swaddled on their backs, their cries woven into the noise of the march, unintentional yet strangely powerful, for a child's wail was thought to pierce deeper than any crafted instrument. In this way, even the smallest of the village joined the ritual, unknowing participants in the great defense. The elders, meanwhile, walked at the heart of the procession, their steps measured, their eyes sharp beneath brows furrowed by decades of watching the seasons turn. Some leaned on sticks, their gait slow but steady, yet no one thought them a burden. On the contrary, their presence was vital. They remembered the winters when famine stalked the land, and the summers when fever burned through families. They recalled how processions had been raised in the past, which songs had been sung, and how long the torches had been kept burning. Their voices, cracked and deep, carried authority when they began a chant, and when they lifted a hand to point at a hedge or barn where shadows clustered, the villagers believed their senses keener than most. Elders were thought to see further into the unseen, to detect where spirits might be hiding, and so their guidance shaped the very path the procession took. This mingling of children and elders gave the ritual a rhythm that was unlike any other gathering. Between the high cries of youth and the low murmurs of age, the procession's soundscape became layered, echoing the balance of life itself. It was as though the voices spanned the entire arc of existence, leaving no weakness for spirits to exploit. The middle-aged and strong added their own vigor, but it was the extremes of age that gave the ritual its soul, for in them the continuity of the village was embodied. A spirit might trouble a man or woman in their prime, but what force could stand against the joined voices of the very old and the very young? The presence of children also gave the ritual its moments of tenderness amid the solemnity. A boy might stumble with his torch, and an elder's hand would steady him. A girl might grow weary of the chanting, and a grandmother would whisper encouragement, teaching her an old refrain to renew her strength. These exchanges, though small, deepened the sense that the procession was more than superstition. It was a lesson, a passing down of memory and courage from one generation to the next. Even when the children grew tired and were carried in arms or on shoulders, their presence was not diminished. They were the proof that the ritual mattered, that the night was fought not only for survival but for the future that rested in small, drowsy heads. For the elders, the processions often stirred memories of their own youth, when they too had walked in fear and defiance. Some recalled faces long gone, friends and siblings who had once carried torches beside them. In the flicker of firelight, they sometimes imagined they saw those same faces again, shadowy but smiling, as if the spirits of their ancestors marched with them still. This sense of continuity gave the processions a weight that was more than fear. It became an honouring of the dead, a recognition that the living carried forward what had been entrusted to them. To walk in the night was thus not only to defend against unseen forces, but to walk in the company of all who had come before. When dawn finally approached, and the flames guttered low, it was often the children who collapsed into sleep first, their small bodies draped across benches or pallets, soot-smudged and weary, yet safe. The elders, though exhausted, sat awake longer, watching the smoke rise from dying torches, whispering prayers of thanks that the village had once again passed unscathed into morning. For them, the survival of the night was not taken lightly. It was a victory to be cherished, a fragile triumph over forces that might strike again tomorrow. And in the sight of children sleeping soundly after hours of chanting and shouting, they found their reward, the assurance that life would continue, and that the ritual had held back the dark for one more night. Thus, children and elders together formed the twin pillars of the procession, one offering the freshness of beginnings, the other the wisdom of endings. Between them, the village found strength, binding the youngest breath to the oldest memory, weaving a shield of voices that no unseen spirit could breach. It was in this mingling of innocence and experience, fragility and endurance, that the night ritual drew its deepest power, turning fear into something almost sacred, a shared act of survival written across generations. The path through the fields. The course of the procession was never chosen at random. Each path traced through the village and beyond was deliberate, shaped by memory, necessity, and the invisible borders that peasants believed separated the safe from the unsafe. To step into the fields was to step into the very lifeblood of the community, for every seed buried in the soil represented hope for survival, every furrow carved into the earth a defense against hunger. Thus, when the villagers lit their torches and raised their voices, they walked not merely to occupy the night, but to inscribe protection upon the fields, circling them like shepherds guarding their flock from predators unseen. The procession often began at the heart of the village, where cottages pressed close together, their thatched roofs dark against the torchlit sky. From there, it spread outward, winding along the lanes that led to barns, byres, and granaries. The air smelled of hay and dung, the warm breath of sleeping animals puffing softly through wooden slats. The villagers moved as if to remind these creatures that they were not forgotten, that the same flames which guarded the fields also guarded the beasts upon which so much depended. For a plague among cattle or sheep could mean ruin as surely as a failed harvest, and many believed that spirits sought to sicken animals first, weakening the village by gnawing at its foundation. From the barns, the path curved toward the fields themselves. These spaces by day were busy with ploughs and hoes, but at night they stretched into darkness, vast and unyielding. Each furrow seemed like a wound in the soil, open to intrusion. Villagers walked along the edges, circling wheat, rye, or barley fields, as though drawing a line no spirit might cross. Their torches cast a glow on the stubble left after harvest, or shimmered faintly on young shoots just beginning to sprout. At each corner, the company paused, raising voices in louder chants, stamping the ground with deliberate force, as if to anchor the ritual into the very earth. Elders whispered that corners were the most vulnerable places, where spirits lingered waiting for weakness, and so these were given special attention, bathed in firelight and sealed with words of warding. Beyond the fields, the procession sometimes extended into the meadows, where animals grazed in warmer months. Here the darkness pressed heavier, for hedgerows and stands of trees crowded close, hiding what might slip unseen between the shadows. Torches threw long lines of light across the grass, making the dew sparkle as though the earth itself answered the fire. Dogs barked nervously at the edges, their noses twitching, as if scenting presences their masters could not see. The villagers pressed forward nonetheless, voices rising, rattles shaking, bells clanging. For to leave a meadow unguarded was to invite misfortune, and no one wished to wake at dawn to find a milk cow stricken or a flock scattered by something no eye could name. Sometimes the path carried the procession near the churchyard, and here the tone grew hushed. The graves of the departed were thought to rest uneasily, especially on nights when the veil between worlds was said to thin. To pass near them was to risk stirring the dead, yet to avoid them entirely was to leave the village exposed. And so, torches were lifted higher, chants deepened, and the sound of bells grew steadier. Some villagers crossed themselves, others whispered the names of their kin buried beneath the soil, hoping to calm their spirits and enlist them as allies rather than foes. In these moments, the procession felt not only like a defense, but like a negotiation between the living and the dead, a recognition that both shared the land, though they walked it in different ways. The route always returned at last to the thresholds of the homes. The circuit around the village was incomplete until each cottage had been included in the fiery ring. Torches flared as they passed before doorways, voices rose as they neared windows, and some villagers paused to strike doorposts with staves or sprinkle handfuls of salt. These gestures sealed the protection, anchoring it not only to the open land but to the private spaces where families slept. It was here, at the edge of field and home, that the procession's power reached its fullest strength, enclosing the entire community in a circle of fire, sound, and word. The path through the fields thus became more than a physical route. It was a map of the villagers' fears and hopes, an outline of what they cherished most. Each step inscribed meaning onto soil, meadow, and stone, reminding both themselves and whatever unseen listeners lingered in the night that this land was not unguarded. It was theirs, and they would walk it together, again and again, until dawn broke and the shadows fled. To the spirits, the path was a barrier. To the people, it was a declaration of belonging, and in the slow rhythm of torches circling the fields, the villagers claimed their fragile place in a world where darkness was always waiting to press in. Masks and disguises. The torches flared, the bells clanged, and the chants rose into the night. But for many villagers, these protections were not enough. To walk exposed beneath the stars, one's true face lit by the flames, seemed a risk too great when spirits were thought to linger close. And so arose the strange custom of masks and disguises, a habit that turned the nightly procession into something halfway between a sacred rite and a carnival of shadows. With soot smeared across cheeks, with cloths tied over mouths, with carved wooden visages strapped across their brows, men and women stepped into the night, not as themselves, but as shifting figures who could confuse and terrify whatever unseen beings might seek to follow. The making of masks was itself an art, carried out with patience during the day. Farmers carved rough visages from scraps of wood, gouging deep eyes and crooked mouths with knives dulled from fieldwork. Women stitched hoods and cowls from worn linen, sewing bits of animal hide or feathers into their seams to lend them a wild, unearthly air. Children, too, were given disguises, simple smears of ash drawn across their faces, or sprigs of straw tucked into their belts until they resembled little scarecrows walking the lanes. When the procession gathered, it seemed less a group of neighbours than a host of unfamiliar beings, each transformed by torchlight into something uncanny, half human and half other. The purpose of these disguises was twofold. First, they were meant to confuse the spirits themselves. Villagers believed that the invisible world was cunning, that it sought to recognize the faces of those it wished to harm, to carry sickness into their homes, or blight into their fields. By wearing masks, one denied the spirits the certainty of recognition, offering instead a shifting surface, a stranger's visage that the unseen could not claim. Second, the masks were meant to frighten. Just as the villagers feared the sight of spirits, they imagined that the spirits feared grotesque visages in return. A carved wooden mask with bulging eyes and gaping teeth, painted crudely with soot and blood, might send a spirit fleeing into the dark, mistaking the wearer for a being more fearsome than itself. The disguises also affected the people who wore them. Beneath a mask, a timid villager might feel bolder, freed from the weight of his own identity. A boy who would normally shrink from the dark might, with his face hidden in paint and shadow, shout louder, wave his torch higher, strike the earth with greater force. Women, too, found freedom in disguise, their features hidden so that their voices blended indistinguishably with men's in the chant. Even elders, stooped and weary, seemed changed when their faces were blackened or hidden, their steps gaining vigour, as though the mask lent them a new spirit of their own. The procession thus became not only a ward against spirits, but a transformation of the people themselves, allowing them to embody the very strangeness they feared. Some masks were passed down through generations, kept in the rafters of barns, or tucked away in chests until the nights of procession returned. These relics bore the marks of age, cracks in the wood, faded paint, worn straps. Yet their power seemed only to grow with time, for each year they were worn, each night they stood between the wearer and the darkness. They absorbed more of the villagers' trust. Children whispered that the masks themselves remembered the spirits they had frightened away, that when worn again they carried those memories as invisible shields. To place such a mask upon one's face was to don not only a disguise but the weight of years of protection. There were, too, masks that mimicked the spirits themselves, crude caricatures of the beings villagers imagined prowling the dark. Horns carved from branches, jaws fashioned from boar tusks, eyes painted as hollow voids, such disguises blurred the line between mockery and imitation. To wear them was to declare mastery over fear, to say, "We can take your shape, and in taking it, we rob you of your strength." The procession, filled with such faces, became a strange theatre where the human and the otherworldly mingled, where villagers became the very creatures they sought to banish. Outsiders, stumbling upon such a sight, might have thought the spirits themselves had seized the village and were parading through its fields. Yet despite the grotesque appearance, the disguises held a curious beauty. The flicker of flames caught on feathers, the gleam of pitch shone on carved eyes, and the swirl of smoke wrapped the masked figures in an aura of mystery. To march behind them was to feel both frightened and reassured, for though their faces were terrible, they were terrible in service of protection. Children clung to mothers' skirts when the masked figures passed, then relaxed when familiar voices spoke beneath the disguises. In this mingling of dread and comfort lay the essence of the custom: to fight fear with fear, to wield the power of the uncanny against the uncanny itself. By dawn, when the procession ended and the masks were lifted away, the faces beneath were weary but strangely lighter, as though the weight of the night had been carried not by the person but by the disguise. The soot was washed off. The masks hung back in barns or tucked into chests, waiting for another night. But the memory lingered. For a few hours, the villagers had walked as something other than themselves, united in transformation, their fear hidden behind grotesque smiles. And in that fleeting theatre, they believed, the spirits had been fooled, driven back into the dark where they belonged. The silent watchers. Amidst the noise and fire of the procession, not all joined in the clamour. There were always some who stood apart. The silent watchers, men and women who did not shout, who did not strike pots or wave torches, but who moved slowly along the edges of the group, their eyes fixed on the darkness. They were not leaders in name, nor were they excluded, but they carried a different burden, that of watching for signs, listening for whispers, sensing where the unseen might lurk. The villagers believed these individuals possessed a certain sensitivity, a gift or curse inherited through bloodlines or bestowed by fate. Some were thought to be marked from birth, born beneath an eclipse or in the hush of midnight, forever bound to perceive what others could not. Others were widows or widowers, whose grief had opened their hearts to echoes of the other world. Whatever the cause, the silent watchers walked with the procession but never truly within it, their silence a counterpoint to the noise that others raised. They carried no masks, for masks blurred vision. They rang no bells, for bells deafened the ear. Instead, their role was to remain attuned to the subtle, a flicker at the edge of the torchlight, a sudden chill in the air, a movement of shadow that did not match the sway of trees. Children feared them, whispering that these watchers could see spirits clinging to rooftops or crouching at crossroads. Adults treated them with wary respect, for though their silence unsettled, their warnings were rarely ignored. If a watcher paused and pointed to a hedge, the chants grew louder there. If one drew back from a particular field, torches were lifted higher and corners were circled twice. Their gestures guided the unseen geography of the ritual, charting the places where danger lay hidden. Stories about these watchers circulated as readily as tales of the spirits themselves. Some said that they could speak with the dead, though they seldom admitted as much. Others claimed they dreamed of the spirits before they appeared, their sleep filled with wandering shapes that later revealed themselves in the night. A few were rumoured to have stared directly into the face of an invisible being and lived to tell of it, though they carried the memory in silence, unwilling or unable to describe what they had seen. The watchers themselves rarely spoke of their abilities. When questioned, they often shook their heads or muttered vague replies, as though naming their gift might diminish it. Though their role was essential, it brought unease. To live with heightened perception was to live apart. Neighbours sought their guidance yet kept them at arm's length, uncertain whether their closeness to the unseen made them dangerous. A watcher might be invited to a feast, yet find no one eager to sit beside them. A woman known for her sharp eyes might be asked to bless a newborn's cradle with her gaze, but that same gaze could make others shift uncomfortably if it lingered too long. And so, while the procession united most in a joyful clamour, the watchers walked in solitude, their silence a reminder that the line between the visible and invisible was thin and that some stood closer to it than others dared. During the procession, their silence served another purpose as well. Amid bells and chants, there were moments when the clamour subsided into murmured voices and the hiss of torches. In those pauses, the watchers leaned forward, straining to hear what others could not. A rustle of reeds might reveal more than the scurrying of a rabbit. A sudden gust might carry a whisper not formed by human lips. When they straightened, when their hands rose or their heads turned sharply, the crowd responded instinctively, tightening formation, raising their noise again, striking the ground as if to stamp out whatever the watchers had sensed. No proof was offered, but no proof was needed. Trust was given, for better to heed the silent warning than risk leaving a spirit unchallenged. In the torchlight, their figures looked uncanny. Where others moved in bright arcs, faces shifting between fire and shadow, the watchers seemed caught in half-light, neither wholly of the procession nor wholly of the night. Their eyes reflected flames but did not waver, and their stillness amid the clamour made them seem carved from stone. To children, they were frightening beings who seemed more spirit than neighbour. To elders, they were indispensable, for without them the procession risked wandering blindly, unaware of what pressed against its borders. At dawn, when the ritual ended and villagers returned to their homes, the watchers often lingered. They would stand on the edge of the fields or near the churchyard, gazing at spaces where others saw only mist and earth. Their silence deepened then, as though they alone could see the residue of the night, the footprints of spirits pressed invisibly into soil, the pale shimmer of something retreating with the Sunday. Some said the watchers never truly left the company of the unseen, that even in daylight they carried the burden of what their eyes and ears could detect. For the rest of the village, the rising sun brought relief, but for the watchers, it marked only a pause until the next nightfall. Thus, the silent watchers became an inseparable part of the processions, feared yet revered, human yet half-other, guiding the chants and torches not with noise but with their stillness. Their silence was its own form of sound, a listening so deep that it seemed to draw the invisible into view. And in their presence, the villagers found both dread and reassurance. For while it was unsettling to know that someone could sense what lay beyond, it was far more frightening to imagine marching without them, blind to the shadows that pressed close against the fire's edge. Fear of the threshold. For all the wandering of the processions through lanes, barns and fields, it was the thresholds of homes that drew the greatest attention, for these narrow spaces between outside and inside were believed to be the most fragile borders of all. A door was not merely a slab of wood. It was a barrier between the known safety of the hearth and the restless uncertainties of the night. Windows, shutters, even the thin seams where walls met the earth, all were places where unseen spirits might slip through if left unguarded. And so, when the procession returned to circle the village's cottages, the focus of chants and torches shifted, converging on thresholds with the same intensity soldiers might give to defending a city's gates. It was here that the clamour grew loudest. Bells rang faster, torches flared higher, and chants deepened into a low, resonant hum that seemed to shake the very timbers of the houses. Men struck the ground with staves before the doorways, stamping invisible seals into the soil, while women sprinkled salt or ashes across the lintels, tracing protective lines in gestures half learned from priests and half preserved from older hidden traditions. Some poured drops of milk or ale on the doorstep, offerings meant to appease any wandering soul that might otherwise grow resentful and slip inside. These small acts, repeated night after night, turned each threshold into a stage where fear met ritual, where the invisible was acknowledged and challenged in the same breath. Children were often instructed to stand within the doorway as the procession passed, clutching small charms in their hands, pieces of iron, sprigs of rosemary, or carved crosses of wood. Their presence at the threshold was seen as vital, for innocence itself was thought to be a shield, a brightness that spirits could not bear to confront directly. Elders, meanwhile, leaned on doorposts, murmuring blessings that blended scraps of psalms with words older than memory. The sight of generations gathered together at a single doorway, faces lit by torchlight, gave the moment a solemn weight, as though the entire village acknowledged that the battle against the unseen began not in the fields or meadows, but in the thin space between home and world. Thresholds carried stories of their own. Villagers spoke of nights when milk curdled without reason, or bread turned to stone upon the hearth signs. They believed that a spirit had crossed the doorway unchallenged. There were tales of sleepers who woke to find themselves cold though the fire still burned, as though something had slipped in and drawn warmth away. To guard thresholds was to guard against these small but troubling misfortunes, the subtle thefts of well-being that eroded the fragile security of daily life. And because these events were so often linked to the entrance of a house, the ritual weight of the threshold grew heavier with each retelling. Not all protections were visible. Some families buried charms beneath their doorstones, coins marked with crosses, shards of pottery etched with strange symbols, even bones of animals thought to ward off evil. These remained hidden from passing eyes, yet the villagers trusted that their silent presence strengthened the defenses each time the procession passed. Others hung talismans above lintels, horseshoes, wreaths of herbs, or bundles of feathers tied with twine, objects that seemed ordinary by day, but glimmered with uncanny significance in the torchlight of night. The threshold thus became not only a physical boundary, but a palimpsest of protections, each layer reinforcing the next, until the space between inside and outside was charged with meaning. When the procession halted at a doorway, the family inside often stepped forward with gifts. A ladle of ale poured into a shared cup, a piece of bread broken and passed along, sometimes even a strip of dried meat offered to those who carried torches. These gestures were not merely hospitality, but a way of binding the household into the greater act of defense, acknowledging that their safety depended upon the strength of the community. In return, the chants might grow louder at their threshold, the torches waved more fiercely, as if to repay the offering with added layers of protection. The fear of the threshold was not only about spirits, but about vulnerability itself. In a world where wolves could snatch livestock, where thieves might slip silently into barns, and where plague crept unseen from neighbour to neighbour, the doorway stood as the point where the world pressed closest upon the family. To reinforce it with ritual was to claim, however briefly, a sense of mastery over forces that could never truly be controlled. The villagers knew the door would not stop famine, nor the shutters plague, but still they circled, still they chanted, still they laid charms and sprinkled salt, for to neglect the threshold was to invite despair. At dawn, when the torches guttered out and smoke hung faintly over the lanes, families looked first to their thresholds. A sweep of ash across the doorstep, the unbroken shape of salt, the intact talisman above the door, all were signs that the night had passed safely. Children stepped cautiously across them, mothers whispered brief prayers before beginning the day's chores, and fathers touched the wood as though it were a companion. In this way, the threshold became not only a boundary of fear, but a reminder of endurance, proof that the home had stood through another night's uncertainty. Thus, the fear of the threshold shaped the very heart of the procession. It was not only about circling fields or driving spirits from meadows, but about sealing the fragile spaces where life itself was most vulnerable. The doorway, narrow and humble, bore the weight of the villagers' hopes, and by surrounding it with fire, sound, and ritual, they turned it into a fortress not of stone, but of belief. And in that belief, they found the strength to face the dark again and again. Animals in the ritual. The villagers did not march alone in their nocturnal defense. Alongside the humans, animals were drawn into the ritual, their bodies and voices woven into the strange tapestry of sound and movement that filled the night. In the Middle Ages, beasts were not merely possessions but companions in survival, their health bound tightly to the welfare of every family. It was only natural that they too should be enlisted in the defense against the invisible, whether by choice or by instinct. The procession, therefore, often carried the barking of dogs, the lowing of oxen, and even the hiss and flutter of geese, a chorus of creatures whose noise added to the clamour meant to frighten unseen spirits away. Dogs were the first and most obvious guardians. Faithful by day, they became even more valued by night, their sharp senses thought to pierce the veil between worlds. Villagers trusted that a dog's bark was never wasted. If it rang out into the darkness, it meant something stirred there, something that human eyes could not detect. During the processions, dogs bounded at the edges of the torchlight, their eyes gleaming, their voices rising in sharp echoes that cut into the night. Children clung to their fur, emboldened by the animal's energy, while adults nodded approvingly, convinced that each bark chased away lurking shadows. In some villages, collars of bells were fastened around the dogs' necks so that their movements spread a constant jangling, turning them into living instruments of noise. Oxen, though slower and less eager, were sometimes led into the march as well. Decorated with ribbons or draped in cloth smeared with soot, they moved heavily beside their handlers, their great bodies swaying with each step. The deep rumble of their lowing mingled with the chants, a sound so resonant that it seemed to vibrate through the very soil. Oxen were symbols of strength and endurance, and their presence reassured the villagers that the might of the living world stood with them. Some elders said that spirits feared the steady patience of such beasts, for it reminded them of the earth's own power, slow yet unstoppable. To march with oxen at one side was to march with the weight of the land itself. Geese, surprisingly, played their part too. Known for their loud cries and fierce defense of territory, they were sometimes carried in wicker baskets or driven in flocks ahead of the procession. Their honking rose in shrill counterpoint to the chants, startling in its suddenness, impossible to ignore. Villagers believed that spirits recoiled from the sharp clamour, unnerved by its unpredictability. The flutter of wings and the snap of beaks added a sense of wildness to the ritual, as though the creatures of air had joined in alliance with humankind against the night. Children laughed nervously at the geese's antics, but their elders took the noise seriously, recognizing its value in the chorus of defense. Even smaller creatures found their place. Cats were less often seen in the processions, for their silent ways seemed ill-suited to the noisy ritual, yet their presence at thresholds was valued. A cat crouched at a doorway, eyes gleaming in the torchlight, was thought to hold back misfortune, its gaze sharp enough to pierce the invisible. Horses, too, sometimes stamped at the edge of the crowd, their snorts and whinnies mingling with the soundscape, while chickens, startled from their roosts by the clamour, clucked and flapped in sympathetic uproar. To the villagers, this cacophony was not disorder but a widening of their circle, a proof that even the animals shared in the defence of the community. There were symbolic roles as well. Some animals were adorned with charms or marked with crosses of ash upon their foreheads before being led into the mart. A cow might carry a wreath of herbs around its horns, a dog a scrap of red cloth tied to its collar, a goose a painted stripe upon its wings. These decorations transformed the creatures into living talismans, visible signs that the boundary between human and beast was blurred for the sake of protection. In their decorated forms, they became part of the ritual itself, as essential as the torches or the bells. To modern eyes, such practices might seem whimsical or quaint, but for the villagers, they were matters of survival. When a cow fell sick, the entire family's livelihood was imperiled. When a dog failed to bark, the night seemed more dangerous. When geese grew silent, it was taken as a sign that spirits lingered too close. The health and voices of animals were woven into the fabric of belief, and to include them in the procession was to acknowledge their vital role in both life and ritual. At the procession's end, animals were often blessed with gestures of gratitude. Children stroked the dogs' heads, fathers patted the oxen's flanks, mothers sprinkled water or grain for the geese. These small acts bound the creatures closer to the human world, affirming the shared struggle of all living things against the unseen. By dawn, As torches died and bells grew silent, the chorus of animals quieted too, returning to barns, byres, and coops. Yet the memory of their voices lingered in the minds of the villagers, reminding them that the defense of the community was not borne by humans alone but by every living thing that shared the fields and hearths of their world. Thus, animals in the ritual were not bystanders but companions, their cries mingling with human chants, their movements extending the reach of firelight and sound. Together, they created a procession that was not merely human but a chorus of the living earth itself, standing defiant against the invisible presences of the night. And in that chorus, the villagers found strength, for what spirit could endure the combined voices of man and beast, joined in noisy alliance beneath the darkened sky. The midnight return. After hours of circling the fields, ringing bells, chanting, and waving torches, the time would always come for the villagers to return home. The procession, though vigorous and defiant, could not last until dawn. Firewood and pitch were finite. Throats grew hoarse, and bodies grew heavy with fatigue. Midnight became the moment when the ritual reached its end, the turning point when the clamorous defiance softened into weary silence. The return was as much a part of the rite as the march itself, for it marked the transition from active confrontation with the unseen to trust in the protections laid down, trust that the night, though unfinished, would hold steady until morning light. The return began with a subtle lessening of sound. The chants, once loud and insistent, dwindled into murmurs. Bells were struck less frequently, their echoes stretched thinner across the fields. Torches still blazed, but the vigour with which they were raised faltered, arms lowering as weariness crept in. The villagers did not yet scatter, for to end without order was dangerous, but they began to draw inward, turning their steps back toward the cluster of cottages that marked the heart of their world. The line of fire that had wound outward across barns, meadows, and graves now coiled back into itself, like a serpent folding into sleep. As they passed familiar landmarks in reverse, the hedges where the watchers had paused, the corners of fields where chants had been strongest, the thresholds where salt still glimmered faintly, they moved with a slower, more reflective pace. Children, exhausted from hours of noise and excitement, leaned against their mothers, eyes half closed, their small bells falling silent in their hands. Dogs trotted more heavily now, tongues lolling, though still alert enough to give the occasional bark into the darkness. Oxen moved with a steady patience, their breath clouding in the cool air, while the geese, if still present, honked more softly, their cries blending with the fading chants. The approach to the village lanes was always marked by a shift in mood. Here, the torches illuminated the familiar shapes of cottages, the curves of roofs, the outlines of doors and shutters. Relief mingled with fatigue, for the villagers knew they had completed their circuit, drawn the protective circle around their homes. Yet the ritual was not dismissed with haste. Instead, they paused at the central space, whether it was a green, a crossroad, or the shadow of the church tower, and gathered into a close circle. The flames cast their faces in tired, flickering light, and for a brief moment, silence reigned. It was a silence heavy with meaning, the quiet of people listening inwardly, wondering if the night had truly been held at bay. Then, in that circle, the final chants were uttered. These were slower, lower, and more solemn than the cries that had rung out across the fields. They were prayers of closure, words meant not to drive away but to seal, as one might press wax onto a letter or latch onto a gate. Elders led them, their voices trembling with age yet steady in conviction. Children mumbled sleepily, barely awake, yet still part of the rhythm. The sound rose into the sky, not in defiance but in acknowledgement. The villagers had done what they could, and now the rest belonged to forces beyond their control. Once these closing words were spoken, the torches were extinguished, one by one. Some were doused in buckets of water, hissing and steaming as their light died. Others were pressed into the earth, leaving faint trails of smoke that curled upward into the night. A few, carefully preserved, were carried home still burning, their flames fed into hearths as a bridge between the protective fire of the procession and the warmth of the household. Each extinguished torch marked an end, but also a continuation, for the villagers believed that the smoke carried the last remnants of their ritual outward, drifting into corners and cracks where spirits might still linger. The dispersal was quiet, for the villagers were weary. Families peeled away from the circle one by one, slipping back into their homes through thresholds now freshly protected. Doors closed softly, shutters latched, children laid in their beds with soot still smudged on their faces. Dogs curled by doorways, ears twitching, still alert though their bodies longed for rest. Elders remained awake a little longer, seated by the hearth, whispering the last prayers while watching the embers glow. For them, the midnight return was not complete until they felt the weight of night ease from their shoulders, until the silence outside settled into something less threatening, more like sleep. For all its fatigue, the return carried a quiet dignity. The villagers knew they had done what was necessary, that their fields, their animals, and their homes had been encircled with fire, sound, and voice. They did not claim victory. Such language was too proud, too certain for a world where famine and sickness could strike at any time. But they did claim effort, a stubborn defiance that told the night it would not go unanswered. And in that effort, there was a kind of peace. To lie down after the procession, weary but unafraid, was to rest within the fragile comfort of community, a comfort forged by every step, every chant, every spark that had flared against the darkness. Thus, the midnight return was not simply the end of a ritual, but its fulfillment. It was the point where fear had been faced and carried through, where the people's unease had been transformed into action, and where action gave way at last to rest. The unseen might still wander, but the village had spoken, had walked, had surrounded its world with noise and flame. And in that knowledge, the people could close their eyes, trusting that the dawn would come, and that the night, once again, had been endured. The secret of the leaders. Though the procession was a communal act, without rank or rigid hierarchy, it was always guided by certain figures, men and women, who, though never formally appointed, carried within themselves an authority recognized by all. They were the ones who signaled the beginning, who lifted the first torch, who set the rhythm of the chant or struck the first bell. The villagers called them simply the leaders, though their role was far more ambiguous than the name suggested. Half respected, half feared, they occupied a space between the everyday world of ploughs and hearths and the shadowed realm of spirits and unseen forces. Their secrets were not always spoken aloud, but their presence shaped the procession as surely as the torches shaped the darkness. Some leaders were chosen by age and memory. The eldest among the village often knew the patterns of past years, when plague had struck, when famine had bitten deep, when storms had torn roofs from barns. They remembered the routes taken, the chants raised, the charms used in times of crisis. To follow them was to trust the continuity of generations, to believe that the wisdom of survival had been preserved in their voices. Yet not all leaders were grey-haired. Sometimes it was a man or woman marked by strange experience, a vision in a dream, a near escape from death, a sudden illness survived against all odds. Such experiences were taken as signs, proof that the unseen had brushed against them and left behind a kind of power, whether blessing or burden. These leaders often carried objects of significance, a staff carved with runes whose meaning had been forgotten, a bell said to have been blessed in distant lands, a torch lit from embers, preserved from a holy feast. Such items lent weight to their presence, tokens that made the invisible feel tangible. Children watched wide-eyed as these relics were lifted, convinced that without them the procession would falter. Adults, though they might mutter skepticism by day, dared not question them by night, for the risks of neglecting tradition were too great. Better to trust, better to follow, better to believe that the leader's object bore power against the unseen. Yet there was always unease surrounding the leaders. Their closeness to the world of spirits set them apart, much like the silent watchers, though in a different way. Where the watchers observed and guided through silence, the leaders commanded through action. Their voices cut through the noise, their gestures shaped the path. If they said to linger at a threshold, the crowd obeyed. If they signaled to turn aside from a meadow, no one argued. But in this authority lay suspicion. Were they truly protecting the village, or did they hold some pact with the very forces they claimed to ward away? Was their knowledge of spirits born of resistance, or of kinship? These questions were rarely asked aloud, but they hovered in the background, giving the leaders a half-shadowed aura, both revered and distrusted. Legends grew around them. One tale told of a leader who, centuries before, had vanished into the forest mid-procession, his torch flickering like a star swallowed by the trees. Days later he returned, pale and hollow-eyed, claiming to have bargained with spirits for the safety of his village. From that day onward, it was said, no storm touched their fields, though the man himself never again spoke above a whisper. Another story spoke of a woman leader who carried a mask carved in the likeness of a monstrous face. It was said the mask had been gifted by the spirits themselves, who, tired of being defied, had handed over their own likeness so that the village might wear it and confuse them forever. Whether true or not, such tales deepened the aura of mystery around the leaders, binding them more tightly to the invisible than ordinary folk. Their role extended beyond the march itself. In the days before a procession, the leaders might walk quietly through the fields, tracing patterns in the soil with their staffs, or hanging small bundles of herbs in hedgerows. They might be seen at wells, scattering drops of ale into the water, or standing by church doors long after Mass had ended, as though communing with something unseen. Villagers watched these actions with curiosity and apprehension, never interfering but always remembering. By the time night came, these preparations gave the procession a sense of inevitability, as though it were not merely a choice but a ritual long fated to unfold. During the march, the leader's strength was not in shouting louder or carrying brighter torches, but in knowing when to heighten the noise, when to let silence fall, when to quicken the pace, when to slow. They seemed attuned to rhythms deeper than human voices alone, as though listening to a countersong played in the air, one that only they could hear. If a gust of wind extinguished a torch, it was the leader who relit it calmly, steadying the crowd. If a child cried in fear, it was the leader who bent low, pressing a charm into the child's hand. Their composure was the anchor around which the clamour turned, keeping the chaos from splintering into panic. Yet when dawn came and the villagers returned to their homes, the leaders often withdrew. They did not linger to accept thanks or share in ale. Instead, they walked alone, their torches carried until the last ember died, their relics wrapped carefully and hidden from sight. In daylight, they returned to their ordinary roles: farmers, mothers, carpenters, shepherds. But the villagers never quite saw them the same way. They remained marked, touched by their role, standing always a step apart. Thus, the secret of the leaders was not merely in their knowledge or their relics, but in their place between worlds. They belonged to the village, yet they also belonged to the night, to the invisible forces that hovered just beyond firelight. They were bridges, half human and half mystery, whose presence both reassured and unsettled. Without them, the processions might falter, lose shape, scatter into mere noise. With them, the villagers felt guided, connected to a tradition deeper than memory. And though their secrets were never spoken aloud, they were felt in every step of the march, in every chant, in every pause where the crowd turned its eyes toward the figure at the front, waiting for a sign to go on. The church and the folk. The presence of the church in medieval life was inescapable, for its bells marked the hours, its priests pronounced blessings and judgments, and its symbols stood at every village's centre. Yet, when it came to the strange nocturnal processions, the relationship between church and folk was neither simple nor harmonious. On some nights, the chants that rose in the torchlight carried Latin words from the liturgy, borrowed from the Mass or the Psalms, echoes of sermons repeated faithfully by peasants who scarcely understood their meaning. On other nights, the voices carried older words, half pagan, half forgotten, sung in dialects the church mistrusted, phrases passed down from ancestors who had walked these fields before Christendom stretched across them. The two worlds existed side by side, sometimes entwined, sometimes opposed, always uneasy. There were priests who embraced the processions, standing at their head with crucifix raised, blessing the torches before they were lit, and sprinkling holy water along the paths that circled barns and fields. For these men, the ritual was a way of binding the community together under the protection of heaven, a chance to transform local fear into collective prayer. They encouraged the use of bells, for bells had long been consecrated as weapons against demons, and they urged villagers to replace their folk chants with psalms and litanies. In such places, the procession became almost indistinguishable from a nocturnal liturgy, a wandering church that carried the sacred into every corner of the village's life. But there were also priests who frowned upon the practice, who saw in the masks and disguises, in the rattles and shrill cries, the shadow of older pagan rites that should have been extinguished long ago. They warned their flocks that to mimic spirits was to invite them, that to offer milk or ale at thresholds was superstition, not piety, and that to rely on charms of iron or salt was to doubt the sufficiency of the cross. Such priests preached fiercely from the pulpit, declaring the processions dangerous, even sinful, a mingling of holy and profane that risked leading souls astray. In their villages, the night rituals persisted but often took on a more secretive air, the people slipping into the darkness without clerical blessing, their chants whispered instead of sung aloud. This tension shaped the processions in subtle ways. Where the church's presence was strong, the rituals bore a greater mark of order, crosses carried high, Latin phrases repeated with solemnity, relics brought forth from the sacristy to touch each threshold. In other places, where the priest's disapproval hung heavy, the rituals grew wilder, more defiant, clinging to their older forms as acts of quiet resistance. Villagers believed that the church could protect the soul, but they also believed the body, the crops, and the animals required more immediate defenses rooted in the soil, the seasons, and the memories of ancestors. To abandon these was unthinkable, for survival demanded every possible shield, both sacred and profane. Yet even in their conflict, the church and the folk were bound together by necessity. Priests might denounce the processions, but when plague struck or storms ruined the harvest, they themselves were called upon to walk the fields with aspergillum and book, to raise chants against unseen threats. And when the people carried their torches into the night, they often invoked the saints alongside the old spirits, weaving Christian and pagan into a single plea for safety. The Virgin was called upon to shield children, Street Michael to guard livestock, Street Roch to hold back pestilence. In the mingling of these names with older cries, one could hear the dual heart of the procession, a ritual of faith, but also of memory, reaching deeper than any pulpit could touch. This mingling did not go unnoticed. Chroniclers in monasteries sometimes recorded such practices with a tone of disapproval, noting that villagers howled like beasts in the night or carried torches as pagans once did. Yet their very complaints preserved the reality. The processions endured, and not even the church could banish them. For the people who walked, the ritual was not a contradiction to faith but an extension of it, a way of embodying protection with fire and sound, of binding heaven's promises to the soil beneath their feet. To them, the church gave form to salvation, but the procession gave form to survival. By dawn, the church's influence might be visible in the sign of the cross traced over a doorway, or the priest's presence in the final prayer. Yet just as visible were the smears of soot on faces, the bundles of herbs tucked above lintels, the worn masks and rattles carried home. In the glow of morning, the two worlds coexisted, never fully reconciled but never entirely separate. And perhaps it was in this tension that the true strength of the procession lay, a ritual shaped by faith but rooted in earth, defended by the church yet nourished by older echoes, belonging not wholly to either but to the people themselves. Thus, the night procession stood as a living negotiation between church and folk. In its chants one could hear psalms and spells mingled. In its symbols one could see crosses and charms side by side. In its leadership one could find both priests and masked villagers guiding the way. It was a fragile balance, yet one that reflected the reality of medieval life, where survival demanded every form of help, whether it came from heaven, earth, or memory. And in that mingling, the villagers found a ritual that was truly theirs, neither wholly sacred nor wholly profane, but entirely necessary. Echoes in neighbouring lands. Though each village believed its procession unique, born of its own fears and fields, the custom was far from isolated. Across the breadth of Europe, echoes of the same practice stirred in different forms, shaped by local landscapes and languages. but united by the same human impulse: to drive away what could not be seen, to guard life against the unseen powers of night. Travelers who passed from one valley to another, from one market town to the next, often returned with tales of similar rituals, and in their words, villagers heard confirmation that they were not alone in their struggle. The night was feared everywhere, and everywhere men and women found ways to answer it with noise, fire, and voice. In the Germanic lands to the east, there were processions known as Klopfkleng, where villagers struck wooden boards and beat the walls of their homes to chase away wandering souls believed to roam at year's end. Bells were rung there too, but the sound was mingled with the sharp crack of sticks on doors and barns, a clamour intended to drive spirits from every hiding place. In alpine valleys, masked figures called perchten or skiachperchten strode through villages during the long nights of winter, their carved wooden faces twisted into monstrous shapes. These beings, half men and half spirits, were believed to frighten away darker forces, a mirror of the disguises worn in other lands. To see such figures marching by torchlight through the snow was to witness a cousin of the very processions that circled fields in the west. In the Celtic fringes, too, echoes of the practice resounded. There, at the turning of the year, processions were held with lanterns carved from gourds or turnips, their grotesque faces lit from within to ward away restless dead. Songs in old tongues drifted over moors and hills, mingling with the bleating of livestock and the barking of dogs driven along as part of the rite. Some called upon ancestral spirits directly, not merely to banish them, but to enlist them as guardians of the household. The line between frightening and honouring blurred, and the processions became both warding and welcome, a dialogue between living and dead that carried across centuries. To the south, in Italy and Spain, villagers carried out luminarias and censeradas, parades of light and noise that wound through narrow streets, filling the air with clanging pots, bells, and chants. There the rituals often mingled with festival, so that fear and celebration intertwined. Children ran with lanterns, men wore animal masks, and women carried baskets of herbs to scatter at thresholds. Though the church attempted to fold these customs into saints' days and processions of relics, the underlying pattern remained. The people claimed their nights with fire and sound, believing that to remain silent was to invite misfortune. Even further afield, whispers of similar practices appeared. In the Slavic lands, winter nights were filled with carolers who masked themselves in animal shapes, singing loudly as they passed from home to home, receiving gifts in return for their noise and blessings. These koledari were more festive than fearful, yet their songs carried the same intent: to banish the chill of darkness with warmth, to remind the unseen that the living stood united. In Scandinavia, echoes of the wild hunt haunted the skies, processions of riders, half myth and half dread, believed to storm through the clouds at night. Villagers answered these with their own torches and chants, hoping to keep the spectral riders from swooping down upon their homes. What united all these variations was the conviction that noise and fire could push back against the invisible. Whether striking doors in Germany, carrying lanterns in Celtic lands, donning monstrous masks in alpine villages, or clanging pots in Iberian towns, the people of medieval Europe shared a belief that the night was not empty, and that only collective defiance could keep its dangers at bay. Each community believed its own ritual to be ancient, unique, and necessary. Yet in truth, they were all threads of a wider fabric, woven across lands and languages by the common fear of the unseen. Travellers and pilgrims carried these echoes between regions. A shepherd from one valley might tell of horned masks worn in another. A monk might note strange chants in his chronicles. A merchant might describe lanterns shaped like faces in a distant town. These stories spread, sometimes altering the rituals they encountered, sometimes strengthening them by comparison. Villagers, hearing of distant customs, felt affirmed in their own. If others too marched by torchlight, then surely the need was universal, the threat real, and the act of defiance indispensable. Thus, the processions of the night were not isolated curiosities, but part of a great, unspoken conversation that stretched across Europe. Each land had its own name for the ritual, its own symbols and songs, yet beneath the variations lay the same heartbeat, the desire to endure, to guard what was fragile, to face the mystery of darkness together. In this shared impulse, the villagers glimpsed a truth larger than themselves, that humanity, no matter where it dwelled, could not resist shaping the night into something survivable through fire, sound, and the stubborn unity of the march. The weight of fear. Beneath the fire and noise, beneath the chants and masks, there lay the deepest foundation of the night processions. Fear, not a fleeting fear, like the shiver of a child at a sudden noise, but a heavy, enduring weight that pressed upon entire communities. In the Middle Ages, survival was fragile, balanced on the edge of harvest and health, and the unseen was always close at hand. Fear of famine, fear of pestilence, fear of sudden misfortune, these were not rare terrors but constant companions. The rituals of the night were born not out of idle fancy, but out of necessity, an attempt to confront that fear and give it form so that it might be endured. To the medieval villager, the world was full of threats that could not be explained. A sudden storm might flatten the barley fields just as the harvest neared. A blight might wither wheat overnight, leaving whole families hungry. A fever might sweep through a cottage, taking child and parent alike within days. Without the knowledge of weather, medicine, or soil that later ages would bring, such calamities demanded explanation, and the explanation most ready at hand was that unseen forces had turned against them. Spirits were blamed for spoiled milk, demons for withered crops, witches for illness that spread like wildfire. The invisible became the vessel into which every inexplicable dread was poured, and so the night procession was not only a ward against spirits, but against the weight of all misfortune itself. Fear pressed not only upon the body, but upon the imagination. When the fields stood silent at dusk, villagers did not see only empty furrows. They saw presences hovering over them, waiting to ruin the seed. When a cow lowed strangely in the night, they imagined something pressing upon its back, leeching away its strength. When a child coughed in the dark, they heard not sickness, but the brush of a spirit's hand across its chest. These interpretations filled the silence of the night with menace, and to remain indoors was to sit helpless under its weight. By stepping outside together, torches blazing and voices raised, the villagers pushed back against that helplessness. Fear still existed, but it was faced, spoken, and confronted. The weight of fear also bound the villagers together. Alone, each family was vulnerable. Together, they formed a shield. In the clamour of bells and chants, each person felt their own private dread dissolve into the greater sound. A man who feared for his sick child found comfort in the sight of neighbours walking beside him. A woman who worried over her barren field took strength from the chorus that circled it. Fear, shared, became lighter, and the ritual gave form to that sharing. The procession was thus not only a battle against spirits, but a communal act of bearing one another's burdens, turning individual terror into collective defiance. Yet the fear never vanished entirely. Even as torches burned and chants rose, a hush might fall when the wind shifted, or when an owl called from the trees. In those moments, the villagers felt the weight press closer, reminding them that the unseen could not be fully banished. They marched not with certainty, but with determination, knowing that misfortune might still come, yet refusing to let it pass unchallenged. Their ritual was a fragile defense, but it was better than silence, better than cowering alone in the dark. And in that fragile defense lay a kind of hope, a belief that effort itself could tip the balance, that fear answered was fear diminished. The chroniclers and scholars who later wrote of such practices often dismissed them as superstition, the simple ignorance of peasants who could not explain their world. Yet to those who lived them, the rituals were survival. They knew fear intimately, in every breath, every mouthful of bread, every uncertain dawn. The processions did not erase that fear, but they gave it boundaries. They turned formless dread into a shape that could be circled, chanted against, driven back by firelight. The weight of fear remained, but it was carried with ritual, and in that carrying, it became bearable. Thus, the night processions were not only a spectacle of sound and flame, but a mirror of the village's inner life. They were the outward expression of the weight each man, woman, and child bore daily, the unseen burden of a world where safety was never guaranteed. And in answering that burden with movement, noise, and unity, the villagers found their most essential truth: that fear may never vanish, but it need not conquer so long as it is faced together beneath the stars. Fading into memory, for centuries the processions held firm, repeated night after night, year after year, until they seemed as ancient as the fields themselves. Yet nothing endures unchanged, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ritual began to fade. The world of the Middle Ages, steeped in mystery and uncertainty, gave way to new ways of thinking. Knowledge crept forward, explanations replaced whispers, and what once had been unquestionable necessity began to feel like superstition. The torches still flared, the bells still rang, the chants still echoed through the night, but fewer feet joined the march, fewer voices rose, until at last silence reclaimed the lanes that had once thundered with noise. The fading was not sudden. It began with subtle shifts, like cracks forming in a stone wall long before it collapses. The church, more assertive in its authority, pressed harder against folk customs, branding them remnants of paganism that had no place in a Christian world. Priests who once blessed torches and led chants were replaced by those who denounced such practices as dangerous, sinful, or laughable. Villagers, torn between loyalty to ancestral ways and obedience to the church, began to abandon the noisier, wilder elements of the ritual, keeping only the most acceptable forms: a procession on a saint's day, a prayer at the threshold, a ringing of the consecrated bell. The rest was quietly dropped, folded into silence. At the same time, knowledge changed the texture of fear. The spread of herbal remedies, the careful observation of weather, the recording of patterns in illness and harvest, all these gave people tools to explain what once had seemed the work of spirits. A poor harvest might be blamed on insects rather than demons, sickness on contagion rather than curses. Though fear remained, its shape shifted, and the rituals built to answer the old fears seemed less fitted to the new. Younger generations, raised on the teachings of schools and sermons, mocked the masks their elders had worn, laughed at the idea that noise alone could chase away misfortune. To them, the processions were relics of a darker age, curiosities rather than necessities. And yet, the rituals did not vanish overnight. In remote valleys, on storm-swept coasts, in villages tucked deep in forests, processions continued long after towns had abandoned them. There, where famine and disease still struck with raw force, the need for defiance lingered. Even as the rest of Europe moved towards cities, trade, and new sciences, these communities clung to their torches and chants, unwilling to release the protections that had carried their ancestors through centuries of peril. Travelers sometimes stumbled upon such processions in the 17th or even 18th centuries, astonished to see faces blackened with soot, bells clanging, dogs barking into the night. They described them with curiosity, pity, or disapproval, but always with recognition. Here was an echo of something once widespread, now dwindling into the margins of memory. The fading was also marked by transformation. What had once been a defense against spirits became, in time, a festival. The masks that frightened children were refashioned into costumes for winter merrymaking. The clamour of bells turned into the music of celebration. The torches that once sealed the boundaries of fields now lit village greens for dances. The procession survived, but it shed its dread, becoming play rather than defence. Few remembered its origins, and those who did spoke of them only as old tales, half believed. Thus, the ritual did not entirely die, but was reborn, softened, reshaped by the changing needs of the people. Still, traces of melancholy lingered in the fading. Elders who had marched in earnest processions remembered the weight of fear that gave them purpose. To see their children laugh beneath masks, to watch their chants turned into songs of revelry, was to feel both relief and loss. Relief because the fear had diminished, loss because the solemnity that once bound the community so tightly had dissolved into merriment. What had been an act of survival was now a pastime, and in that transformation, something was left behind. By the time the Enlightenment spread its light across Europe, The night processions had become curiosities recorded in chronicles, studied by scholars or whispered about as quaint traditions of rustic folk. The torches no longer circled fields in earnest. The bells no longer rang with urgency. The chants no longer rose into the night as cries of defiance. Yet the memory of them lingered in stories told by firelight, in festivals that carried echoes of their forms, in the quiet gestures of protection that some families still made at thresholds. The ritual had faded, but its memory endured, woven into the fabric of culture like threads from a garment long worn but never forgotten. Thus, the fading into memory was not an ending but a transformation. The processions passed from necessity into tradition, from tradition into story, from story into silence. Yet in that silence, the memory lived on, ready to surface in the minds of those who, centuries later, still wondered at the fears of their ancestors and the strange, beautiful ways they had sought to hold back the darkness. Traces in folklore, though the torches no longer blazed nightly across the fields, though the chants ceased to echo in the lanes, the processions did not vanish without a trace. They lingered in folklore, slipping into songs, tales, and seasonal customs, their memory preserved in forms less fearful but still unmistakable. What had once been a ritual of survival became, over time, a story of the past, half-remembered yet strangely enduring, woven into the rhythms of festivals and the imaginations of generations that followed. In this way, the processions lived on not as nightly defense, but as fragments of culture, hidden in plain sight. Festivals of light, still celebrated in many regions, bore the imprint of those ancient processions. Lanterns carried through villages on winter nights, parades of masked figures at the turning of the year, bonfires lit to mark solstices and saints' days all carried echoes of the old custom. Children with candles in paper globes resembled the torchbearers of centuries past, though they no longer walked in fear but in delight. Masks, once carved to terrify spirits, were now worn in carnival, their grotesque faces softened by laughter. Bells that once rang to scatter unseen beings now jingled merrily in songs, their tones transformed from defense to joy. In each of these, the form survived even as the meaning shifted, like a melody sung to different words across ages. Stories, too, kept the processions alive. Grandmothers whispered of nights when the entire village marched, when the dark seemed full of eyes and only the clamour of voices could drive them away. Children listened wide-eyed, half frightened, half thrilled, imagining their quiet lanes filled with fire and noise. Some tales grew into legend, of a procession that marched so loudly it shattered a plague's grip upon the town, or of one that carried torches so bright they were mistaken for stars fallen to earth. Others leaned toward the supernatural, telling of spirits glimpsed fleeing before the flames, or of figures who joined the march unrecognized, later revealed to be ghosts of ancestors walking beside the living. Such tales blurred history and myth, yet they ensured the memory was never lost. In songs and ballads, fragments of the chants survived. Simple refrains, once spoken to ward off misfortune, were folded into lullabies or work songs, their protective power forgotten but their rhythm intact. A farmer ploughing might sing a line once used in a midnight march, unaware of its origin. A mother rocking her child might hum a tune that had once driven spirits from thresholds. The words shifted, the meanings dulled, but the melody remained, carrying with it the faint echo of nights when those same notes had been weapons of defiance. Even in gestures, the memory lingered. Families continued to sprinkle salt at thresholds or to hang sprigs of herbs above doorways, not always knowing why, only that it was tradition. Bells were still rung in times of danger, torches still lit in moments of fear, and masks still donned in festival. These small acts, seemingly trivial, were the bones of the old processions, stripped of their flesh, but still recognizable to those who looked closely. Folklorists centuries later, wandering through villages to collect tales, were struck by how often such customs survived, echoes of the old nights when fear had given them birth. In the countryside especially, where memory lingered longer, whispers of the processions carried on into the 19th century. Farmers still spoke of fields that must be circled, of thresholds that must be guarded, though now the rituals were rare, performed only on special nights or during times of extraordinary misfortune. Yet even as practice faded, the idea endured, that the unseen must be acknowledged, that fire and sound still held power, that community could bind itself against the unknown. The procession had become more symbol than action, but symbols, once born, are not easily extinguished. Thus, in folklore, the procession survived, transformed but never wholly lost. They became stories told to children, songs hummed without memory of their origin, festivals that brought laughter instead of dread. Yet beneath the joy, beneath the play, the deeper memory remained, a whisper that once the night had been heavier, once fire and noise had been shields against real terror. And perhaps that whisper gave the rituals their lasting hold, for even in ages when reason banished superstition, the darkness still stirred something ancient in the human heart. And in that stirring, the memory of the processions found a place to endure, alive in the folklore of those who no longer needed them, yet still felt their shadow in the night. What the darkness left behind, when the last torches had long since burned out, when the clamour of bells had quieted into history, and when the chants of the villagers had faded into little more than half-remembered words, something still remained. The night processions, though no longer walked with urgency, had left their mark not only on fields and cottages, but on the deeper fabric of human memory. They revealed something enduring about humankind, the need to confront what cannot be seen, the desire to bind fear with ritual, the impulse to face the dark, not alone, but together. What the darkness left behind was not merely superstition, nor merely story, but a reminder of how communities once shaped meaning out of dread and companionship out of uncertainty. The most immediate legacy was the knowledge of unity. In those long centuries when survival hung by threads, the procession taught that a village, acting together, was stronger than any household acting alone. Fire and sound mattered, yes, but what truly carried weight was the joining of voices, the gathering of generations, the march of feet in rhythm across the soil. Even as the ritual faded, the memory of communal endurance lingered. Later, customs festivals, church feasts, harvest dances drew upon that same sense of togetherness, though stripped of the urgency of fear. The procession had shown that unity itself could be a shield, and that lesson endured far longer than the torches or bells. It also left behind a pattern for how humans grapple with the unseen. The spirits may have faded into metaphor, but the instinct remained. To mark thresholds, to light candles in windows, to ring bells at funerals, to gather in times of plague or disaster. Each of these acts carried echoes of the old processions, born from the same impulse to make the invisible less threatening through tangible gesture. Even in modern times, when explanations for illness or storm are rooted in science, people still light lamps in remembrance, still gather in vigil, still cling to rituals when reason alone feels too cold. The darkness left behind not a superstition, but a blueprint for how humans respond to fear. By ritualizing it, by facing it together, the processions also bequeathed a sense of the porous boundary between sacred and folk. In the mingling of psalms with ancient chants, of holy water with salt, of crosses with masks, the villagers created a hybrid form of belief that showed how resilient and adaptable faith could be. Though the church might have frowned, it too was transformed by contact with such practices, adopting and reshaping them, until the line between doctrine and tradition blurred. This blending revealed a truth about culture, that no fear is fought in isolation, and no ritual belongs entirely to one realm. The echoes of the processions survived in saints' festivals, in carnival masks, in the ringing of bells at times of storm. In each, the sacred and the folk touched one another, leaving behind a shared heritage that endured. What the darkness left behind, too, was a humility before mystery. The villagers of the Middle Ages did not claim mastery of the unseen. They only sought to endure it. They knew the night could never be entirely banished, that misfortune might still strike despite torches and chants. Yet they acted anyway, not to guarantee safety but to make fear bearable. This humility, this recognition that action need not bring certainty, only comfort remained in the stories told after the processions ended. It whispered through folklore, through songs, through quiet traditions at thresholds. It reminded each generation that to face fear is not to defeat it, but to live with it in dignity. In the end, the processions left behind not only traces in culture, but a lasting image of villagers stepping into the night together, torches blazing, bells ringing, voices raised against the silence. That image, though softened by time, still speaks to the human heart. It tells of a people who refused to cower, who transformed unease into ritual, who found in their unity a fragile but real power. And though the unseen beings they feared may no longer haunt our imaginations as they did theirs, the deeper truth remains, that darkness, whether of night, of misfortune, or of fear itself, is best endured not in solitude but in the company of others. So when we think of those nights, the masks, the chants, the watchers, the firelight circling fields, we are not merely recalling superstition, we are remembering the profound human instinct to turn dread into ceremony, to transform isolation into solidarity, to walk together into the unknown. That instinct has never faded, for even today, in different forms, we still gather when shadows fall, still raise light when darkness presses close, still seek comfort in voices joined. What the darkness left behind was not a ritual of old peasants, but a truth for all ages, that no fear is faced more bravely than when faced together, torch in hand, step by step into the night.